At 10:46 a.m. on March 24, 1999, a heavy refrigerated truck slowly entered the Mont Blanc tunnel. At that moment, driver Gilbert Degray was transporting 9 tons of butter and 12 tons of flour for a food processing plant in Milan, Italy. Having driven this route countless times over his 25-year career, everything seemed all too familiar to him. However, after traveling about 2 kilometers into the tunnel, Gilbert began to sense something was wrong. All oncoming vehicles were flashing their lights continuously at him. What's happening? Gilbert wondered silently. He grew uneasy, and a sudden premonition struck. He immediately glanced quickly at the rearview mirror, and at that very moment, his heart stopped. Smoke. His truck was emitting smoke. At first, it was just a thin, wispy trail, but in no time, it had thickened and spread throughout the tunnel. In an instant, the vehicle looked no different from a giant smoke pipe spewing out rolls of black smoke. "This is serious," Gilbert exclaimed, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind panicking as he realized the situation was gradually spiraling out. These were the initial developments of one of the worst tragedies in the history of tunnel transportation worldwide. And in today's video, we will explore what led to this tragedy, why a fire could break out inside the tunnel, and what the final death toll was. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel. Your support is a tremendous motivation for us to continue delivering high-quality content for our audience. The Mont Blanc mountain range, with its highest peak in the Alps, stands majestically on the border between Italy and France. Previously, due to the treacherous terrain, crossing this mountain range took up to 7 hours. Therefore, to shorten travel time and facilitate transportation, in 1965, France and Italy collaborated to build a tunnel through the base of Mont Blanc. The Mont Blanc tunnel was once considered an engineering marvel of its time. With a length of up to 11.6 kilometers, 3 times the ordinary tunnels. It became the longest tunnel in the world at that time. Moreover, the tunnel was designed very modernly, using high-performance road surfaces for easy drainage, and equipped with an advanced ventilation system to ensure air circulation inside the tunnel. After completion, travel time across the mountain was reduced from 7 hours to just 15 minutes, bringing immense convenience to residents and transport businesses. However, despite being rated as safe and modern, the Mont Blanc tunnel was not immune to the risk of fire. Throughout its 34 years of operation, 15 fires had occurred there. However, because these fires were small in scale and controlled early, most people did not truly realize the danger of fires in tunnels. But everything changed after the horrific event in 1999. Around 10:48 a.m. on March 24, 1999. Just minutes after Gilbert drove into the tunnel, another truck also entered from the French side. Driver Morat Lebret was on his way transporting goods to Italy. Previously, when drivers passed through the Mont Blanc tunnel, they maintained safe distances between vehicles and traffic in the tunnel was quite orderly. However, on that day, everything unfolded in a completely different direction. When Morat had traveled about 5 kilometers into the tunnel, he suddenly heard a loud explosion from ahead. Immediately, the vehicles in front of him began to slow down significantly and then came to a complete stop. Morat's vehicle quickly got stuck behind another truck. Looking through the windshield, he couldn't see the end of the traffic jam. Worse yet, behind him, more than a dozen vehicles had also formed a long line. Queued up in tense silence. People in the vehicles began looking around, trying to figure out what was happening. But strangely, usually if one lane of the tunnel was blocked, the opposite lane would still flow normally. However, just a few minutes later, after Morat got stuck, traffic from Italy to France also came to a complete halt. At this point, everyone could sense the instability. It seemed something extremely serious had happened ahead, causing both directions of the tunnel to be completely paralyzed. The Mont Blanc tunnel is only 7 meters wide, making it impossible for trucks. As for cars, they also dare not turn left due to the double solid line prohibiting. Time passed. 1 to 2 minutes later, the situation still showed no signs of improvement. Some impatient people began getting out of their vehicles to check the situation ahead. But right at that moment, the sound of the tunnel's ventilation fans suddenly worked. The rumbling noise from the ventilation system startled everyone. Before they could understand what was happening, a horrifying scene unfolded before their eyes. Thick black smoke billowed from the front of the convoy. Initially, the smoke was quite distant, but in the blink of an eye, it surged straight toward them. Like a pitch-black tornado devouring everything in its path. Screams echoed everywhere. Dense smoke enveloped the entire traffic jam area, causing everyone to panic. Some drivers frantically tried to start their vehicles to turn around and escape, but the engines refused to operate. By now, the black smoke had thickened to the point where it was impossible to and then, within that dense smoke, a giant fireball suddenly appeared, whizzing from the front of the convoy toward them. It swept past each vehicle, incinerating everything in its wake. That was the last image many people in the tunnel managed to see. At 11:57 a.m. on March 24, firefighting teams from both Italy and France were immediately dispatched toward the Mont Blanc tunnel. However, the situation had already become extremely critical. An unprecedented, terrifying fire was raging deep inside the mountain. From the east, an Italian fire truck quickly entered the tunnel. Captain Nicola Giorgio Galazzi was tasked with locating the fire and searching for survivors. But could they reach the victims amidst the sea of flames and toxic smoke that surrounded them? Nicola grew even more anxious upon receiving grim news. The tunnel patrol team from the French side and the traumatic firefighting team had lost contact after entering the tunnel. The last position they reported was at shelters number 17 and 13. At least 3 kilometers away from shelter number 22, where the first fire alarm was triggered. This meant they had been blocked before they could even reach the center of the fire. Clearly, the flames were spreading at a terrifying speed. Nevertheless, the Italian firefighting team continued westward in an effort to find survivors. But after advancing 5 kilometers deep, they were all stunned by the sight before them. They discovered 2 trucks fiercely ablaze right in the middle of the tunnel. Billowing black smoke continuously surged toward the French. Some firefighters tried to approach, but were immediately forced back by the intense heat. The temperature at the scene reached at least 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that moment, a firefighter was startled by hearing multiple consecutive explosions. Tires and debris from burning cars flew in all directions. Besides the 2 trucks burning in the thick smoke ahead, many other vehicles were also exploding continuously. However, no one knew exactly how many vehicles were trapped. The situation grew even more desperate as the firefighting team tried to reverse the retreat, but their own vehicle also failed to start. It was at that very moment that Captain Nicola realized why the French rescue team had gone missing. The flames and toxic smoke had depleted the oxygen in the tunnel. Any vehicle entering at this point would stall, and anyone still trapped inside would suffocate. 11:30 a.m.? Just 37 minutes after the fire broke out, black smoke began violently spewing from the French entrance of the tunnel. Both countries, Italy and France, immediately issued a red while mobilizing helicopters and heavy firefighting equipment to the scene. The fire warning level was raised to the highest. According to preliminary reports from the firefighting team that entered the tunnel, the fire seemed to originate from the suspected cause was a truck explosion, but the truth remained unclear. At this point, the number of people and vehicles affected was still unknown. Toxic smoke, deadly heat, and narrow terrain prevented large-scale rescue equipment from accessing the scene. Worse yet, any vehicle entering the smoke zone would stall immediately. The disaster had officially spiraled out of control. The situation became even more serious when both French firefighting teams and the fire brigade from the Fresnes tunnel also got trapped in shelters number 13, 17, and 24 because their vehicles broke down. At this point, even the firefighters became victims in need of rescue. Notably, the Mont Blanc tunnel was designed with 2 levels, including a ventilation tunnel located beneath the main tunnel. Taking advantage of this feature, rescue forces made efforts to reach those trapped through the ventilation system. However, it took more than 5 hours for them to rescue the firefighting teams stuck in the shelters. Nevertheless, the situation near the center of the fire was extremely horrific. The temperature here had risen to 1,200 degrees Celsius, high enough to melt steel. Under such conditions, no one knew exactly how many people were trapped inside. Even if someone reached the shelters near the fire, these places were no longer safe. With the terrible heat, the shelters were now like giant ovens. Continuing the search and rescue was deemed hopeless. Finally, on the afternoon of March 24, after many unsuccessful attempts, the firefighting forces of both countries were forced to until March 26, 1999, after 53 hours since the disaster began. The fire in the Mont Blanc tunnel finally subsided. Immediately, firefighting forces entered again to assess the damage and search for victims' bodies. However, when they approached the central area, they were truly stunned. The scene before them was no different from one from another planet, desolate and deadly. The tunnel lining had completely disappeared. The concrete had melted, forming rough surface patches. An area of more than 2 square kilometers had been burned to ashes. As they went deeper, they began to see the victims' bodies, some lying face down near ventilation openings. Perhaps they had tried to stick their heads in there to find breathable air, but still succumbed to smoke inhalation and were burned in despair. Going further inside, the scene became even more horrifying. 2 trucks, now just skeletons, lay blocking the middle of the tunnel. Behind them were nearly 30 other vehicles, also completely burned by the terrible heat. The steel frames were twisted, deformed, and tightly wound together like melted metal blocks. Inside the vehicles were scattered bodies, a sight that would make anyone shudder. Some victims had tried to run into shelters number 22, 21, and nearby areas to seek a chance of survival. However, the fire lasting for 53 hours had exceeded the endurance limits of the shelters. As a result, they were also burned alive inside these supposedly safe places. There were mothers holding their children tightly in the back seats, as a final reflex to protect them from the tragedy. There were also people still gripping the steering wheel, seemingly trying to drive the vehicle to escape until the last moment. Firefighters even found several charred skeletons under the vehicles, where perhaps the victims had tried to hide to avoid smoke and fire, but ultimately could not escape death. The center of the Mont Blanc tunnel was now like a giant furnace, a metal graveyard with traces of the most horrific tragedy in the history of modern tunnels. After conducting an investigation, authorities determined that the fire originated from 2 refrigerated trucks at the front of the convoy. The tragedy claimed the lives of 38 people, including 1 firefighter and 37 other victims, along with 28 vehicles burned in the tunnel. Specifically, 29 people died while trapped in their vehicles, while 9 others perished in their escape attempts. The most regrettable thing is that all those who entered from the French side did not survive. Conversely, among those who entered from the Italian side, 12 people were lucky to survive and were rescued in time. The question arises, why did an ordinary fire turn into the most horrific tunnel disaster in history? And why were most of the victims concentrated on the French side? Clues about the cause of the fire were found from some partially burned debris in the air filter of one of the 2 burning trucks. Based on this evidence, experts uncovered a horrifying truth behind the disaster. The first truck involved in the accident belonged to Gilbert de Grip, who was lucky to survive the incident. At 10:46 a.m. on March 24, Gilbert took his vehicle through the French toll station and entered the Mont Blanc tunnel. However, no one expected that an unextinguished cigarette had been thrown into the air filter on top of Gilbert's vehicle. While the vehicle was moving, a cigarette butt was blown by the wind into the engine, which itself ignited and started. Smoke began to rise from the rear of the vehicle, causing many oncoming drivers to flash their lights to warn Gilbert. Despite noticing the abnormality, Gilbert was completely confused and did not know how to handle it. Therefore, he continued driving the vehicle, making the situation increasingly worse. By around 10:51 a.m., when the smoke had become too thick, Gilbert panicked and stopped the vehicle to use a fire extinguisher. However, it was too late. His action of stopping the vehicle inadvertently caused the disaster, because when the vehicle stopped, oxygen easily flowed into the burning engine, creating conditions for the flames to flare up fiercely. At that moment, Gilbert's truck was in the middle of the tunnel. On the vehicle, it was fully loaded with butter and flour. These highly flammable materials quickly turned the vehicle into a giant fireball. Panicked by the explosion, Gilbert immediately ran back toward Italy and was safely rescued by the fire brigade. However, those trapped behind him were not as fortunate. The disaster was further exacerbated by serious flaws in the control system. The Mont Blanc tunnel has traffic control centers located at both ends, on the French and Italian. Around 10:50 a.m., the control center on the French side received a series of smoke warnings in the tunnel, but the on-duty staff ignored them, thinking they were false alarms. Therefore, they did not take any response actions. Even worse, the Italian side decided to turn off the fire suppression system. Security cameras at both ends of the tunnel recorded images of thick smoke billowing, but for some reason, no one detected this in time. It wasn't until 10:55 a.m., when the Italian control center received a distress call from tunnel number 22, that they were shocked to realize the severity of the situation. However, due to the surveillance cameras being obscured by black smoke, staff could not clearly identify the cause. In the urgent situation, they could only immediately notify the French side to close the toll stations at both ends of the tunnel, to prevent other vehicles from continuing to enter. However, by then, about 40 vehicles were already trapped inside, including 9 buses and 18 trucks from the French side. All were behind Gilbert's truck, forming a long, deadly queue with no way out. due to a lack of experience in handling tunnel fires. The control staff on the Italian side feared that oxygen levels would deplete, causing those trapped. Therefore, they decided to turn on the ventilation system, pumping more air into the tunnel in hopes of improving the situation. However, as if jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, this decision inadvertently pushed the disaster. The sudden increase in oxygen in the confined space of the tunnel turned it into a giant pressure cooker. The flammable materials on Gilbert's truck, including butter and flour, immediately generated heat equivalent to 30 tons of burning gasoline, causing flames to flare up fiercely, then being blown strongly by the new airflow toward the exit on the French side of the tunnel. As a result, the vehicles behind Gilbert's truck quickly caught fire and burned to ashes. Thick smoke also enveloped the entire tunnel, turning everything into a dense, dark night. Those who realized the critical situation hurriedly turned their vehicles around, but it was already oxygen was depleted, and temperatures rose sharply, causing the engines of all vehicles to stall, making any attempts to move futile. Toxic smoke spread at a speed of 16 kilometers per hour, so fast that no one could escape in time. Those who stayed in their vehicles gradually lost consciousness due to smoke inhalation, while others panicked. But the farthest anyone ran was only 500 meters before collapsing from lack of oxygen. The Mont Blanc tunnel disaster became a great tragedy for both Italy and France, causing heavy losses of life and property. Immediately after the incident, the governments of both countries conducted thorough investigations.
Three main factors contributed to this tragedy. First was the tunnel's poor fire resistance.
Second was the lax surveillance camera system, which failed to identify the source of the problem in time. Third was the lack of escape guidance, leaving people in a state of confusion and despair, unable to find a way to escape. Most notably, in the 34 years since the Mont Blanc tunnel began operations until the incident occurred,
only one fire drill had been conducted. This means that, from the tunnel management company to the fire brigade,
no one truly had experience in handling a fire in a harsh environment like a tunnel. Therefore, when the fire occurred, the on-duty staff made the mistaken decision to turn on the ventilation system, causing the fire to spread further and become uncontrollable. In fact, the moment the ventilation fans were to life, the chance of survival for those trapped in the tunnel had almost completely vanished. Nevertheless, the extraordinary bravery of many firefighters during the rescue operation cannot go unmentioned. Despite the danger, they repeatedly rushed into the fire, but all were driven back by the intense heat and thick, toxic smoke. Among them, Fire Brigade Captain Paluccio Tanashi was an example of courageous sacrifice. After multiple attempts to enter the scene to search for victims, he succumbed to smoke inhalation and died on the spot, as his protective equipment was insufficient to withstand the extreme environment. Not only that, in a shelter near the center of the fire, the rescue team discovered two other bodies. Those of the French truck driver, Morat Lepreb, and the tunnel control officer on a motorcycle, Dina Trio.
That morning, while on duty, Dina noticed Gilbert's truck emitting smoke.
So he immediately approached to assist in extinguishing the fire.
But before he could act, the vehicle exploded.
Dina quickly called for help.
While retreating, he found Morat Lepreb collapsed on the road. Unable to leave him behind, Dina dragged Morat into a nearby shelter, hoping both could hold out and await rescue.
Unfortunately, the fire was too fierce and lasted for 53 hours, causing the temperature in the shelter to rise so high that both were burned alive inside.
Dina Trito's motorcycle was also found in the tunnel.
When discovered, the bike had completely melted, a testament to the fire's terrifying heat. In 2005, after years of investigation and trial, 12 people were convicted of manslaughter. These individuals included the tunnel security director, the former chairman of the tunnel management, and the tunnel operations safety director.
The sentences ranged from 2 months suspended to 6 months imprisonment,
depending on each person's responsibility. The truck driver, Gilbert Pigrati, was also sentenced to 4 months suspended for negligent conduct leading to the tragedy. Financially, the tunnel management company had to pay a total of $17.5 million in compensation to the victim's family,
but that amount still cannot compensate for the pain and loss left by this horrific fire.
3 years after the disaster, the Mont Blanc tunnel was completely renovated and rebuilt with enhanced safety measures. A rescue station was placed right in the middle of the tunnel, combined with clearly marked emergency exits to help those trapped quickly escape in case of an incident. Additionally, security checkpoints and temperature detection devices were installed at both ends of the tunnel, aimed at early detection of explosion risks and timely handling. Not stopping there, the fire strongly influenced the development and adjustment of fire prevention and fighting regulations for tunnel systems worldwide.
To commemorate the victims, in 2007, a memorial was erected right next to the tunnel.
featuring 39 markers representing the 39 lives lost in this horrific disaster. However, even with the investigation concluded, the final moments of the victims remain a subject of controversy. The most common hypothesis suggests that most of them lost consciousness due to smoke inhalation before.
However, some firefighters reported discovering charred skeletons under vehicles.
This raises the hypothesis that the scene may have been more chaotic than previously thought. In the darkness, filled with thick, toxic smoke and terrifying heat, it is difficult to imagine the fear and despair the victims endured.
For most of us, a tunnel fire might seem like a rare accident not worth worrying about.
But the Mont Blanc disaster showed that the time to react when an incident occurs is extremely limited. So, what should you do if you unfortunately encounter a fire in a tunnel? The best advice is to move against the direction of the wind and smoke. Do not try to drive through the fire, as the flames can spread and intensify.
If the vehicle stalls,
immediately exit and find the nearest emergency exit.
This could be your only chance of survival.
Hopefully, from disasters like the online tunnel incident,
we will learn painful lessons to protect ourselves and help others avoid danger. What lessons have you learned from this disaster? Please share in the comments below. We look forward to receiving your feedback. If you find this content useful, please share it with more people.
Hit the like and subscribe to the Realm of the Unseen Real Incidents channel so you don't. Thank you for listening, goodbye and see you again.
If the veil stirred, subscribe and meet the next encounter.